In this video, I'm going to tell you about 5 of the biggest myths in wargaming. You're watching this on the internet, which is a series of tubes. This one's called YouTube, so, that's how that works. But when there's so much information out there in the world that you can have access to 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, there are times when you will get information that's frankly either maybe misleading, straight up not right on purpose, or by accident, things like that. And that's how rumors get spread in certain situations. And it's also sometimes how myths get spread about literally anything out there in the world information-wise, specifically in hobbies, maybe in wargaming. So we're going to talk about some myths, kind of, just sort of break it down a little bit, not necessarily say this is where it came from, because really, who knows, but try to explain them for you, the person interested in getting into wargaming, so that you can hopefully understand the difference between the wheat and the chaff. So let's go at a big one right off the bat, and that is that wargaming is too difficult or too expensive. Possibly too difficult and too expensive. Depends on who you talk to. And all of these types of hobbies have levels to them. I did a video a long time ago about, is wargaming too expensive? And I talked a little bit about that. And in that video, by the way, pachow, I talked about drawing and how that's a hobby that you could literally just sit down with a pencil and a piece of paper that will cost almost nothing, probably things you have around your home, and you could start to draw. And so that's, a great hobby for that. But I had people in the comments who were like, well, the paper that I use is pretty expensive, or, I use this very expensive German, ink pen when I draw, so that's not cheap and things like that. Or, a Wacom digital tablet and Photoshop and all that stuff, that gets real expensive, and it's a monthly subscription and all that kind of stuff. And all of that is technically true. But that's the way that it works with nearly every hobby within reason. Admittedly, it's almost impossible to play a war game with as little as a pencil and a paper. But you could draw out your own little miniatures, and then even if you didn't have a scissors, you could tear them out and fold them over, and you could make terrain on a paper, and just if you had a pencil and a paper, you could do it. Now, most people aren't going to do that because it doesn't, maybe you dig that. I don't know. I don't dig it. But the thing is that the hobby, as far as expense is concerned, is as expensive as you want to make it. If you are interested in taking the most expensive big honkin' models that are the newest and the hottest from Games Workshop right now, yeah, they're going to cost a bunch of money. There are models out there that are even more expensive. Look into Kingdom Death. It can be a very expensive hobby if you let it do so. But on the other hand, as I've said a bunch of different times in the past, you can also go onto eBay and buy a bunch of used stuff and strip the paint off and repaint it. You can use inexpensive paints. I'm going to tell you probably not to use hobby paints, but like the craft ones that you get at the craft store. But I've seen plenty of stuff with people painting with those paints and doing a fine job. I prefer to use the stuff aimed more towards miniatures, but it's all about picking levels and deciding on, well, what do I want to do? What's my level? What am I going to do as far as cost and things like that? If you say, well, yeah, it's really super expensive to get into, Leica photography. Yeah, Leica just put out a camera recently that's $9,000, and it's tiny. And it's amazing or whatever, I guess, and it's made in Germany and all that stuff. But you can also use your phone, you know what I mean? And which you already have. And so there's a lot of different things that you can do to look at a hobby to mitigate cost. And if you're like, but I have to become a Leica photographer, or I have to become an Age of Sigmar player who's got 3 dragons in their army, it's going to cost a bunch of money, and that's just the way it works. So then you have to kind of set expectations. On the flip side of that, difficulty. There's a lot of people that think that wargaming is very, very difficult because they look at difficult games. They look at games like Warhammer 40,000, where you need, depending on the army these days, at least 4 books to play, and they're thick books, and they're very, there's a lot going on. But there's a lot of games out there, too, that don't cost that much, that you can get into, play, and have a good time. The thing about tabletop wargaming, and I talk about this all the time, is that the fun that you have with it is kind of what you make from it. If what you want is to tell a really fun story with your friends and have this battle where all of a sudden this thing all kind of hinges on this one last attack and this one last dice roll and it goes amazing and all that kind of stuff, that's up to you. If you're like, I have to play to be the best in competition at these big tournaments, then you have to work towards that as well. But it's all about what you want to put into it. I don't like to play particularly difficult games, and so I don't think that wargaming is that difficult. It's kind of the way it works. So it's not necessarily too difficult, and it's not necessarily too expensive, depending on how you try to get into it. If you're like, I have to play Warhammer 40,000 and use the most expensive Forge World models, then yeah, it's going to be pretty expensive and it's going to be difficult, but you don't have to go that way. Here's one that kind of refers to the previous myth, and that is the idea that a wargame rule set, if it is very dense, very detailed, just thick, right, is better than a thinner, less detailed, perhaps even more whimsical rule set. And that's, if you prefer super, super crazy crunch and 38 different books you have to go through, then okay. But in general, for most people, specifically who are getting into the hobby, starting out a little bit easier with a thinner book that's got maybe simpler rules, or not necessarily a rule for every last little thing, is actually generally a little bit easier to get into, which gets you into the hobby. And then you can go from there to start deciding, do I want to start really ramping up my rules and going into to systems that are very, very crunchy? There are folks out there, myself included, who started in a game called Battletech, which back in the day was made by a company called FASA, which I don't know what FASA stood for, something or other, but I don't remember it anymore. But nowadays I think it's owned by, well, it's technically owned by Catalyst Game Labs or something like that, Catalyst. And when I was in middle school, and that was kind of about all that was out there, it was really interesting because it was very detailed and you had these big robots. And I got to be honest with you, a lot of what kept me interested in Battletech in middle school was thinking about big stompy robots, you know what I mean? But now there's plenty of games out there that you can play big stompy robots without having to try to memorize like that much stuff or flip through those many pages in a book like that. And let's be perfectly frank as well, when Battletech first came out, that book was pretty thin. And then every single time as they come out with a new edition, it gets thicker and thicker and thicker. So, again, for people who really still dig Battletech right these days, that's great. I'm glad to hear it. But if you're thinking about getting into wargaming and you're like, yeah, but a thin little 16-page book could not possibly quell my thirst for wargaming fun, that's not really true. I would definitely give some of the thinner, easier games a try, specifically at the beginning, to find out if this is even an avenue that you want to traverse down. Another thing that I hear all the time is that only the biggest companies, the biggest, huge corporate behemoth companies in our industry, only they make the best stuff. Everybody else doesn't cut it. And that's also, again, to some degree, opinion, but overall, in general, not true. Because there are folks out there, plenty and plenty of folks out there, who love the concept of using anything but the big company's stuff. Now, some of them are trying to save money. Some of them are trying to stick it to the man, things like that. For me, one of the reasons why I like looking at stuff outside of, again, let's say Games Workshop, them being the biggest in the industry, one of the reasons I like looking at that stuff is because it's just different than the Games Workshop stuff. I still enjoy Games Workshop stuff. Don't get me wrong. I still build plenty of their models. I've been playing Warcry pretty much steady as my main kind of driver these days. And if you've been watching me on Twitch, that's all I've been painting for like at least the last 6 months, if not longer. So don't get me wrong, I still like Games Workshop, but I also like stuff by Anvil Industries and Cromlech and Puppets War and things that I'm finding, 3D printed stuff that I'm finding online and then either getting people on Etsy to print for me or getting good friends to print for me, that kind of thing. And it's the concept that if it's not made by the biggest companies in the industry, and not just in wargaming as well, this is also very frequently a board game thing, it's very frequently a role-playing game thing. If it's not made by these biggest companies, it's just not worth your time, is just not true. You may say, this is exactly what I need. I need Age of Sigmar. Everything else is garbage. That's fine, but that doesn't mean that that is the best in the industry. That's just the thing that you like. But to sit down and say, well, I don't know if I like this, but it's not made by the big guys, so it's obviously not good, is just wrong. Another myth is that you need to paint every single day. Otherwise, what are you even doing? You're not doing it right. That's also not true. Now, if you want to be absolute top tier, I want to be an award winner, I want Crystal Brush and Golden Demons just stacked up on my shelf, and then you probably do end up, just as a matter of course, painting every single day. If you are a commission painter and you want to get paid, you're probably ending up painting every single day. And these things happen. But if you are a hobbyist, specifically if you're just getting into it, the more you paint, the better things will turn out for you, because you will increase your skill. You will get to a point where you kind of usually hit a plateau, and then at that plateau, your skill may not go up much more, but then you have a tendency to get faster. I made a video a long time ago about that. Pachow. But if you want to get past that plateau where you're now like, this is my skill, but I'm getting faster, and you want to go even beyond that, that's when you end up starting to paint every day. But if you paint, once every couple of weeks, that's better than never painting at all. If you're trying, if you've bought the stuff, right? You know what I mean? If you're not interested in it, I'm not saying that someone who's not into the hobby is bad because they aren't into the hobby. I'm saying if you've bought in and spent the money, but you never touch it, then, maybe you should think about trying to flip that stuff or give it to a friend or, whatever, something like that. But if you're like, I want to be able to do this, but I really only have time because I got 2 jobs and I got 3 kids and all that kind of stuff, and I only get, to do it once every other Saturday, that's better than never. So don't worry that you're not painting enough unless you are really trying to up your output tons, because the more you paint, the more things you'll get done. That's certainly true. And if you're trying to really increase your ability, your skill level, because you need to practice, just like you do with musical instruments or writing or anything else vaguely creative or even non-creative. You still need to practice on a lot of different things to get better at them. That's just the standard. But you don't need to do it every single day. Otherwise, you're a bad person. That's not how it works. The last myth is mostly a myth. The concept that it is really super hard to find somebody to play with in wargaming. It's really hard to find people to play with. It is really hard to find people to play with if you are looking for people who already play the game that you like, already have everything all figured out, and know all the rules, and have all the stuff painted, or at least built, and that kind of stuff. That can be difficult. It can be very difficult if you're, specifically if you're not into one of the big games. If you're like, man, I'm into Malifaux or Bolt Action, which are still pretty good sized games, but not like, the biggest. You're like, I'm into Malifaux, but I just can't find any Malifaux players in my area. Well, no, you probably can't. That may be difficult. If you live in a big city, you might be able to, and there's different avenues for doing that online and trying to find people and all that kind of stuff. But who might play Malifaux with you is your cousin, if you have one, or your sibling, if you have one, or your significant other, if you have one, or maybe even a parent or something like that. I talk about this pretty frequently, but teaching other people to play ends up hopefully turning them into opponents that you can continue to play with down the road. So that's one of the big reasons why I tell people, especially if you're trying to get started or if you're having a hard time finding people to play with, get into a skirmish game, because it's much easier to build and paint 2 small armies than it is to build and paint 2 large armies. So take a look at the people in your life and try to see about getting them involved and see if they're interested. Now, they may be like, nope, tabletop games are dumb. I only play video games, or I only read books, or I only like to watch movies, or whatever, and that's fine. But very frequently, you can even take some of those things and be like, oh, so you like books? Yeah, I do. Well, what about like Lord of the Rings? Oh, I love Lord of the Rings. There's a Lord of the Rings game that we could play here, but that's got the little Gimli and the little Legolas and all that stuff. And then you'd be like, really? And so these are things you can look into. If you are trying to find people out there who are ready-made, turnkey opponents who know how to play the game the same way you do and all that kind of stuff, yeah, that's few and far between. Very frequently, you can still find them, but it takes some work. But talk to the folks in your life and see if you want to get them interested. Maybe a coworker, even anybody like that. And if you've got the things set up and are willing to teach, you may end up with a new opponent. So I hope that dashing these nefarious wargaming myths has helped you in your hobby. And understand that for every one of these myths, there are going to be circumstances in which they're not myths, they're just truth. It's too difficult to get into wargaming. There are folks that can barely see, they can't see close at all, or they have issues like holding a brush, or there's, or tremors, or there's all kinds of different things, or they don't have any time at all for hobbies. Well, that's a whole different thing. So for every one of these, obviously there are outliers that says, well, actually, but in general, these things that a lot of people kind of throw around out on the internet and through different forums and things like that, if you actually sit down and kind of look at them, they're coming from a place of an opinion. The fact that like, oh, there's no good war games out there except for Games Workshop. Well, that's a person who really likes Games Workshop and doesn't want anybody else to play anything else because they're concerned that they're not going to have people to play with if people start playing this other game that's getting more popular or whatever the deal is. There's a lot of different reasons why people throw these myths out there as truths. But I'm trying to, hopefully as a person who's been doing this for a long time and talks to a lot of folks, I want to help you folks understand that these things are definitely myths that you can overcome. And I hope you get more gaming in. 1, 2, 3, folks.